Hello, and welcome back to Best Sleep History. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Go ahead and get comfortable, settle into your pillows, and let yourself relax. Tonight, we're going on a journey through the sometimes sweet, sometimes shocking, and often completely bizarre world of ancient love and dating. You think modern dating is complicated? Wait until you hear how people found love thousands of years ago. From kidnapping as courtship to beauty contests for choosing a wife. From love potions to arranged marriages that determine the fate of kingdoms. The history of romance is fascinating, strange, and surprisingly entertaining. So take a deep breath, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's explore how people fell in love, got married, and built lives together in the ancient world. Let's start in ancient Egypt, where love and marriage were surprisingly modern in some ways, and completely foreign in others. Here's something that might surprise you. Ancient Egyptians married for love. Unlike many ancient cultures where marriages were purely political or economic arrangements, Egyptian couples often chose each other based on genuine affection. We have love poetry from ancient Egypt that sounds like it could have been written yesterday. One poem from around 1300 BCE reads, "My heart remembers well your love. Half of my temple is combed, but I go off rushing. When I find my beloved, I'll comb the other half." Can you imagine? 3,000 years ago, someone was so excited to see their crush that they literally ran out with half their hair done. That's relatable. Young Egyptians had remarkable freedom compared to other ancient cultures. They could meet at festivals, in markets, or along the Nile. Courtship involved gifts, flowers, jewelry, perfumes. Men would write love letters on pottery shards. Women would respond with poems of their own. But here's where it gets interesting. Egyptian courtship also involved some practical magic. Love spells were common, not evil curses, but hopeful charms meant to attract someone's attention or ensure their faithfulness. One spell instructed a woman to write her beloved's name on a piece of linen, tie it to a live scarab beetle, whisper her wish to the beetle, then release it. As the beetle flew away, it would supposedly carry her message to the gods, who would arrange the match. Another charm involved mixing honey with various herbs and applying it as makeup, believing it would make you irresistible. Ancient Egyptian cosmetics companies would probably have made billions with that marketing. Marriage itself was remarkably straightforward. There was no big ceremony, no religious ritual required. A couple simply agreed to live together, moved their belongings into shared quarters, and that was it. They were married. Sometimes there was a feast with family and friends, but it wasn't legally necessary. Women in Egypt had considerable rights. They could own property, initiate divorce, and keep their own wealth. If a marriage ended, the woman took her belongings and her share of jointly acquired property. For the ancient world, this was extraordinarily progressive. Divorce was also simple and non-stigmatized. If a couple couldn't get along, they separated, divided their property, and that was that. Both were free to remarry. There's even a divorce settlement from around 2000 BCE where a man had to promise his ex-wife continued financial support and a share of their household goods. Ancient alimony. Egyptian marriage wasn't about religious sanctity or eternal bonds. It was a practical partnership based on mutual affection, shared responsibilities, and, hopefully, genuine love. In that sense, they might have understood modern relationships better than many cultures that came after them. Now let's travel to ancient Rome, where love and marriage were considerably more complicated and often much less romantic. Roman marriage, especially among the upper classes, was primarily a political and economic arrangement. Fathers chose their children's spouses to forge alliances, consolidate wealth, or gain political advantage. Love was nice if it happened, but it certainly wasn't required. Girls could be legally married as young as 12, though marriages were often arranged years before that. A father had complete authority over whom his daughter married. The bride's consent wasn't legally required, though some kind fathers considered their daughter's preferences. The engagement process involved contracts, detailed legal documents specifying dowries, property rights, and terms of the marriage. Romance took a back seat to property law. But here's where Roman courtship gets truly strange. There was an old tradition, supposedly dating back to Rome's founding, of marriage by capture, literally kidnapping women as a form of courtship. The legend goes that early Rome, founded by outcasts and refugees, had a severe shortage of women. So Romulus, Rome's founder, invited the neighboring Sabines to a festival, and during the celebration, Roman men grabbed Sabine women and carried them off to be wives. This rape of the Sabine women became romanticized in art and literature, though rape in Latin meant kidnapping rather than sexual assault. Still, it's a disturbing origin story for marriage. By the classical period, actual kidnapping marriages were illegal, but the tradition survived symbolically. Roman wedding ceremonies included a ritual where the groom would abduct his bride, lifting her over the threshold of his house while she playfully resisted. The bride would ceremonially weep and cling to her mother, pretending she didn't want to leave. This theatrical kidnapping was considered essential to a proper wedding. It symbolized the bride's transition from her father's household to her husband's. And yes, everyone knew it was theater, but tradition demanded it. Once married, Roman wives had limited rights compared to Egyptian women. A woman passed from her father's control to her husband's. She couldn't own property in her own name, make contracts, or divorce without her husband's consent, at least in early Rome. However, Roman marriage evolved over time. Later forms of marriage allowed women more independence. By the late Republic, some marriages didn't transfer a woman's legal identity to her husband at all. She remained under her father's nominal control, which paradoxically gave her more freedom, since fathers were often absent or deceased, leaving women effectively independent. Roman men, especially upper-class ones, often had mistresses and visited prostitutes. This was socially accepted. Women, however, were expected to remain faithful. Double standards are not a modern invention. Still, there are touching examples of genuine Roman love. Pliny the Younger wrote beautiful letters to his wife Calpurnia, expressing real affection. When apart, he would hold her letters and reread them constantly. "I take up your letters," he wrote, "and I imagine I am holding you." So even within Rome's transactional marriage system, love found a way. Ancient Greece presents a complex picture of love and sexuality that doesn't fit neatly into modern categories. First, let's talk about marriage for women in classical Athens, because it was restrictive in ways that might shock you. Athenian women, especially from respectable families, lived largely secluded lives. They spent most of their time in the women's quarters of the house, separated from the male-dominated public world. They rarely left home except for religious festivals, and even then, they were chaperoned. Girls were typically married around age 14 or 15 to men in their late 20s or early 30s. They had no say in choosing their husbands. The marriage was arranged by their fathers, negotiated like a business contract. The bride wouldn't have known her groom well, if at all, before the wedding. Courtship, as we understand it, didn't exist for respectable Athenian women. You didn't date. You were informed you were getting married, and that was that. The wedding itself involved ritual and ceremony. The bride would be bathed in water from a sacred spring, dressed in fine clothes, and given away by her father. There was a procession to the groom's house, with music and torches. The groom would lead his bride into their new home, and the marriage was consummated that night, completing the union. After marriage, an Athenian wife's job was to manage the household and produce legitimate heirs. Her husband would spend his time in the agora, at the gymnasium, at political meetings, anywhere but home during the day. For emotional and intellectual companionship, Athenian men turned to symposiums, drinking parties where men reclined on couches, drank wine, discussed philosophy, and entertained themselves with music and conversation. Women weren't invited, except for entertainers called hetairai. Hetairai were educated courtesans, skilled in music, conversation, and wit. They accompanied men to symposiums, engaged them in intellectual discourse, and yes, provided sexual services. But they were more than prostitutes. They were companions, often highly respected, sometimes wealthy and influential in their own right. The most famous hetaira was Aspasia, who became the partner of Pericles, Athens' greatest leader. She hosted a salon where philosophers gathered, taught rhetoric, and influenced political thought. Socrates supposedly learned from her. That's how respected some hetairai could become. Now let's address same-sex relationships in ancient Greece, particularly between men, because this was an accepted part of Greek culture that doesn't fit modern categories of sexuality. Pederasty, relationships between adult men and adolescent boys, was common and socially acceptable in many Greek cities. These weren't seen as homosexual relationships in the modern sense. They were educational mentorships with a romantic and sexual component. An older man, the Erastes, would court a younger male, the Eromenos, usually a teenager. The relationship was supposed to be educational, the older man teaching the younger about philosophy, politics, and virtue. Physical intimacy was part of it, but so was genuine affection and mentorship. These relationships followed rules. The older partner was expected to be the pursuer, the younger the pursued. The relationship should eventually transition to friendship as the younger man matured, and crucially, both men were expected to eventually marry women and have families. Female same-sex relationships existed too, though we know less about them. The poet Sappho from the island of Lesbos, yes, that's where the word lesbian comes from, wrote passionate love poetry to other women. Whether these relationships were sexual or romantic is debated by scholars, but her poetry is undeniably intense and affectionate. Greek attitudes toward love and sexuality were simply different from ours. They didn't categorize people as heterosexual or homosexual. They thought in terms of roles, age, and social status. It's a reminder that human sexuality and romantic customs are deeply shaped by culture. Let's sail north now to Viking Scandinavia, where courtship and marriage were surprisingly practical, and in some ways, remarkably equitable. Vikings get a reputation for violence, the raiding and pillaging thing, but their domestic lives were more civilized than you might expect. Viking courtship involved negotiation between families. When a man wanted to marry, his family would approach the woman's family to discuss terms. The woman's consent was legally required. She could refuse a proposal, and her refusal was binding. This was unusual for medieval Europe. Once both parties agreed, there was a betrothal period where the families negotiated the bride price and dowry. The bride price was paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, compensation for losing a daughter's labor. The dowry was the bride's property, remaining hers even after marriage. The wedding itself was a multi-day affair involving feasting, drinking, and rituals. One interesting custom involved the bride and groom drinking mead together from a shared cup, symbolizing their union. This was supposed to last a month, the honeymoon, literally honey month, named for the month of mead drinking that followed a wedding. Viking marriages were partnerships. Women managed the household and farm, while men were away trading or raiding. They held keys to the family's storehouses and controlled the household economy. This gave them real power. Women could own property, inherit wealth, and, here's the really interesting part, initiate divorce relatively easily. If a Viking woman wanted to divorce her husband, she could call witnesses to the door of their house and declare, in front of witnesses, that she was divorcing him. She had to state her reasons, but acceptable reasons included. Her husband was a poor provider, he had been unfaithful, he had struck her in front of witnesses, or, and this is my favorite, he wore clothing that was too revealing. Yes, there's a recorded case of a Viking woman divorcing her husband because he wore a shirt with too low of a neckline. Apparently, he was showing too much chest, which she felt was inappropriate and grounds for ending the marriage. Upon divorce, the woman took her dowry, half the household goods, and often kept the children. The husband had to return to his family's farm. Divorced women could remarry without stigma. This relative gender equity stemmed from practical necessity. Viking men were often gone for months on trading voyages or raids. Women had to be capable, independent, and authoritative to keep farms running and families fed. This economic reality translated into legal rights. Viking courtship also included some charming customs. Men would carve runes into wood as love tokens. They'd compose love poetry, though Viking poetry tended toward the pragmatic. You are strong and wise. Let us join our households. And there was magic, of course. Love spells, charms, and potions were common. Some spells were meant to attract love, others to ensure faithfulness. There's even a recorded spell meant to make someone impotent so they couldn't pursue anyone else. Ancient Vikings were not above petty magical revenge. Despite the warrior reputation, Viking family life emphasized loyalty, partnership, and mutual respect between spouses. Marriages were practical arrangements, yes, but many Viking sagas contain stories of deep love and devotion between husbands and wives. Now let's move into medieval Europe, where two contradictory ideas about love existed simultaneously. Arranged marriage for practical purposes, and courtly love as romantic ideal. For most people, peasants and townspeople, marriage was a practical matter. You married someone from your village or town, someone your family approved of, someone who could help work the farm or trade. Love might develop after marriage, but it wasn't a prerequisite. Peasant marriages were often quite simple. A couple would announce their intention to marry, sometimes in front of the village priest or just witnesses, exchange vows, and that was it. No elaborate ceremony required. The Catholic Church tried to formalize marriage with church ceremonies, but for common people, tradition often sufficed. Among the nobility, marriage was entirely political. Royal and noble marriages forged alliances, ended wars, consolidated territory. The bride and groom's personal feelings were irrelevant compared to the strategic value of the match. Young nobles might be betrothed as children, sometimes as infants, and married as teenagers to people they'd never met. These marriages were consummated whether the couple liked each other or not, because producing heirs was the entire point. But here's where medieval Europe gets interesting: the concept of courtly love. Courtly love was a literary and social phenomenon that emerged in the 12th century, primarily in France. It was the idea that true, noble love existed outside of marriage, and it followed specific rules. A knight would choose a lady, usually someone else's wife, often of higher social rank, and declare himself her devoted servant. He would perform great deeds in her honor, write poetry to her beauty, and worship her from afar. The relationship was supposed to be chaste, at least officially. The lady was unattainable, which made her more desirable. The knight's love was meant to make him more virtuous, more courageous, more refined. This sounds absurd, and in many ways it was. But courtly love became enormously influential, shaping literature, art, and social behavior for centuries. It's where we get the romantic ideal of love as ennobling, of the devoted lover performing heroic acts to win their beloved's favor. Of course, reality was messier than literature. Some courtly love relationships probably did remain chaste. Others definitely didn't. Medieval records include plenty of scandals involving knights and married ladies caught in compromising situations. The Catholic Church had complicated feelings about all this. On one hand, marriage was a sacrament, meant to be indissoluble. On the other hand, medieval theology was deeply suspicious of sexual desire, even within marriage. The ideal was celibacy. Marriage was a concession to human weakness. Divorce wasn't allowed, but annulment was possible if you could prove the marriage had never been valid, perhaps due to consanguinity, lack of consent, or non-consummation. Noble families sometimes went to great lengths to discover distant family connections that would justify annulling an inconvenient marriage. Medieval courtship, when it existed, was heavily chaperoned. A young woman of good family was never alone with a man who wasn't her relative. Conversations happened in public or with chaperones present. Physical contact before marriage was scandalous, and yet, human nature found ways. Young people managed secret meetings, passed notes, found moments of privacy. Medieval literature is full of tales of lovers finding ways around social restrictions, and those tales were popular because they reflected real desires and frustrations. Let's travel east now to ancient China, where marriage was perhaps the most formal, ritualized, and family-centered institution in the ancient world. In traditional Chinese culture, marriage wasn't about the couple, it was about the families. The purpose of marriage was to produce sons who would continue the family line, honor the ancestors, and care for elderly parents. Love between spouses was nice if it happened, but it was absolutely not necessary. Marriages were arranged by parents, often with the help of professional matchmakers. The matchmaker was usually an older woman who knew families in the area and could propose suitable matches. The process was elaborate. First, the matchmaker would present the proposal, bringing gifts from the groom's family to the bride's. If the bride's family was interested, they'd exchange birth dates, which would be analyzed by a fortune teller to determine if the couple's fates were compatible. If the stars aligned, literally, negotiations would begin about the betrothal gifts. The groom's family would send increasingly valuable gifts to the bride's family: silk, jewelry, food, sometimes livestock. The bride's family would prepare a dowry of clothing, furniture, and household goods. Throughout this entire process, which could take months or years, the bride and groom typically never met. They weren't supposed to see each other until the wedding day. The wedding itself was an elaborate ceremony involving multiple days of rituals. The bride would be dressed in red, the color of luck and happiness in Chinese culture, and transported in a sedan chair to the groom's family home. When she arrived, there were ceremonies honoring the groom's ancestors, because the bride was being adopted into his family. She would bow to the ancestral tablets and her new in-laws. Only after these formalities would the couple be left alone together, often meeting face to face for the first time. Now, let's talk about foot binding, because this practice was intimately connected to marriage prospects, even though it's painful to discuss. Foot binding began in the Song dynasty, around the 10th century, and continued for nearly 1,000 years. Young girls, usually between ages 4 and 7, would have their feet tightly bound with cloth, breaking the arch and curling the toes under the foot. The process was excruciating and resulted in tiny, deformed feet called lotus feet. Why would parents do this to their daughters? Because bound feet were considered beautiful and were essential for making a good marriage. A girl with natural, large feet would have difficulty finding a husband from a respectable family. The practice was rooted in class distinctions. Poor women who had to work couldn't afford bound feet. They needed to walk and labor. Bound feet signaled that a woman was from a family wealthy enough that she didn't need to work, that she was refined and delicate. Despite the pain and disability it caused, foot binding persisted because it was tied to marriage prospects. Parents believed they were helping their daughters by ensuring they could marry well. It's a disturbing example of how beauty standards and social pressure can perpetuate harmful practices. Once married, a Chinese wife's life was often difficult. She left her own family and moved in with her husband's family, where she was at the bottom of the household hierarchy. Her mother-in-law ruled the household, and a young bride was expected to be obedient and subservient. Her status would only improve if she produced sons. Daughters were less valued because they would marry out of the family. A wife's security in old age depended on having sons who would support her. But here's something interesting. Chinese literature contains beautiful poetry about marital love. Not all marriages were cold arrangements. Some couples developed genuine affection. There are stories of devoted husbands and wives, of grief when a spouse died, of remarriage being rejected because the first love couldn't be replaced. The poet Su Shi wrote a famous poem mourning his deceased wife. 10 years, dead and living dim and draw apart. I don't try to remember, but forgetting is hard. So even within rigid social structures, love existed. Human hearts are stubborn that way. Finally, let's visit ancient Sparta, because their approach to love and marriage was unlike anywhere else in the ancient world. Sparta was a warrior society, organized entirely around producing the best soldiers. Everything, including courtship and marriage, served this goal. Spartan boys left home at age 7 to begin military training. They lived in barracks, trained constantly, and developed intense bonds with their fellow soldiers. These bonds, often romantic and sexual, were encouraged because they made men fight harder to protect their lovers in battle. Spartan girls, unlike girls in Athens, received physical education. They trained in athletics, supposedly so they'd be strong enough to bear healthy warrior sons. They had considerably more freedom than Athenian women, could own property, and had a voice in household decisions. When it came time to marry, usually in their late teens or early 20s, Spartan courtship was brief and strange. Here's how it worked. On the wedding night, the bride would have her head shaved and be dressed in men's clothing. The groom would abduct her, not for real, but as a ritual, carrying her off to a dark room. They would consummate the marriage quickly, and then the groom would return to the military barracks where he lived. He wasn't allowed to live with his wife. Instead, he'd visit her secretly at night, sneaking away from the barracks, spending a few hours with her, and returning before dawn. This would continue for years. Some Spartan men reportedly fathered children without ever seeing their wives in daylight. Why? The Spartans believed that these brief, secret encounters would make men more virile, that the excitement of stolen moments would result in stronger children. It also ensured that men's primary loyalty remained to their military unit rather than their wives. Eventually, after years of military service, men could live with their wives, but by then they'd spent most of their adult lives apart. Spartan women, left alone to manage households and estates, developed considerable independence and authority. Spartan women were known throughout Greece for their boldness, their education, and their sharp tongues. There's a famous story of a Spartan woman being asked by an Athenian woman why Spartan women were the only women who could rule men. She replied, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." Spartan attitudes toward marriage and love were entirely pragmatic. The purpose of marriage was to produce soldiers. Love was secondary. But those intense military bonds between male warriors, those were celebrated, encouraged, and considered essential to Sparta's strength. And so, we've traveled the ancient world, discovering how people found love, formed partnerships, and built families in ways that range from romantic to bizarre to deeply practical. We've seen Egyptians writing love poetry and choosing their own spouses, Romans negotiating marriage contracts and ritually kidnapping brides, Greeks secluding women while celebrating male bonds, Vikings drinking mead and divorcing over revealing necklines, medieval Europeans arranging political marriages while inventing courtly love, Chinese families consulting matchmakers and fortune-tellers, and Spartans shaving brides' heads and conducting marriages in darkness. What connects all these strange customs? The same thing that connects us to these ancient people: the universal human need for love, partnership, and family. Their methods were different, shaped by their cultures, beliefs, and social structures. But underneath the bizarre rituals and strange traditions, you find the same emotions we feel today: hope, nervousness, excitement, affection, and the desire to find someone to share your life with. The next time you think modern dating is complicated, and it absolutely is, remember that people have always found it complicated. The details change, but the human heart remains remarkably consistent across millennia. As you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe smile at the thought that somewhere, thousands of years ago, someone was nervously preparing to meet their arranged spouse, or crafting the perfect love poem, or sneaking out to see their beloved under cover of darkness. We're all connected through these timeless human experiences. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time for another journey through the fascinating world of history. Good night.